Hello, and welcome to our workshop today on effective lobbying across the aisle using values-based framing to build a broad climate coalition. My name is Elliot. I'm one of the two co-presidents of our Citizens Climate Lobby chapter here on campus, and I'm joined today by Sabrina and Eva, who you will hear from a little bit later. Our purpose at the Citizens Climate Lobby is to build the political will for a national price on carbon, specifically the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Our chapter here on campus specifically focuses on the campus and also Ann Arbor as a whole, but we're one of hundreds of chapters around the country that are working on this issue and getting our preferred bill passed. I don't have to go through each of our principles here that are listed on the slide, but perhaps the most relevant for today is our commitment to nonpartisanship. We really strive to build bridges with people that typically aren't part of the climate conversation, including Republicans and conservatives. And we think the skills we've developed there can be applicable to people even outside of our work at the Citizens Climate Lobby, anyone that cares deeply about climate change. And so that is what we will be trying to share with you today. So as I've alluded to, our goal is to motivate a country that we all know is incredibly divided, especially on this issue, to act on the issue of climate change. And so our targets in this are individuals, organizations, and the Congress itself. A lot of what we talk about might seem like it is geared toward individuals. In some ways this is true, but since individuals make up key organizations and our Congress, the skills that we learned today are going to be applicable whether you're at a family dinner or whether you're lobbying your member of Congress. Furthermore, the strides we make among normal Americans or individuals do filter up. Politicians have to follow the will of the people, especially if the will is strong enough to make or break election campaigns. So it might be helpful to start with the question of what America thinks about climate change. And when we think about the politics of climate change, we can probably often imagine it as a conflict between the people who get the severity of the problem and accept the science and the people who deny the science of climate change. Using information from the Yale program on climate communication, though, which we'll be citing throughout this presentation, we can actually divide Americans into 6 broad categories on climate change belief, ranging from alarmed to dismissive, and the full spectrum in between. The people we think of as getting it make up the alarmed and concerned categories, while the climate deniers make up the doubtful and dismissive categories. Before we really get into it, it might be fun for everyone listening today, guess the proportion of Americans that you think falls into these two groups. So once you have those numbers in mind, I'll show the actual numbers. And assuming you guessed the way that I did, the big takeaway here is that there are far fewer outright deniers than we would think, and that the tent of alarmed and concerned people is already fairly high. So when we delve into the spectrum of the 6 Americas, we see that they really track 2 different variables, how people feel about climate change, which is attitudinal valence, and how involved people are with the issue. We're going to be going into these throughout the presentation, so this graph isn't the most important to understand, but what the big takeaway from this slide is really that understanding these attitudes from people really predicts how likely they are to support national action on this issue, as well as to engage in political activism. So both things that we're very interested in fostering around the country to get action on this issue passed. So for a brief overview of what we're going to be going through today, we're really focusing on 5 different skills. One is looking for unexpected allies. One is staying positive. Another is telling stories and expanding messaging beyond environmental impacts. And finally, connecting with people's values.
When it comes to concern about climate change, some people are alarmed and/or concerned. These people may be unexpected allies or have very real fear about a future with climate change, so it's important to stay positive. To start, let's look at the example of Arthur, who falls into the alarmed group on climate change. If you were talking to Arthur, how would you respond?
Climate change is real, it's happening. It's coming to the point now where We're starting to see the impacts globally. We're starting to see changes in our weather patterns, changes in our climate, and it's terrifying.
Next, let's go through the attributes of the group Arthur belongs to. Alarmed and concerned Americans largely agree that climate change is happening, human-caused, and is harming people in the United States. Alarmed people, especially, are highly engaged on the issue. The majority think about climate change a lot and regularly worry about the related problems. Key to note is that more than half of alarmed and concerned Americans do not identify as liberal or as a Democrat. This means there are many individuals and groups, especially on the right, who the climate movement, which is largely left-leaning, may be missing. Outdoor groups like Trout Unlimited, farmers, faith groups like United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, businesses, and even several conservative climate organizations have been unlikely allies in the fight against climate change, sometimes building support as simple as asking. Now let's get back to Arthur. The key thing I heard Arthur say is that climate change is terrifying. I'm sure this is how a lot of us feel. Climate anxiety can be debilitating, which is a problem if we want to get anything done on the issue and avoid burnout. With people who are alarmed and concerned about climate change, it is important to avoid the scary existential crisis narrative and shift focus to solutions and actions. The next step for people who accept the reality of climate change is to provide hope. This involves focusing on existing solutions like solar and wind, which have seen huge, faster than expected drops in cost. We also need to convey a sense of efficacy. Efficacy includes the ability of others and individuals to make things better. Finally, we should provide people with the tools to act. Teaching someone how to call a congressperson or registering them to vote can turn anxiety into action, so people can share their thoughts, ideas, and concerns in a meaningful way.
All right, so next we have our low involvement category of people, and the best way to engage with these people is to tell stories and expand the conversation beyond the environment. Okay, so let's listen to another video, this time from a cautious individual named Daniel.
It's not the most important thing that we're looking at, it's more the actual waste they're producing and the impact we're having on the environment.
Cautious and disengaged individuals pay little attention to climate change and as a result are unsure about key facts like human involvement, threat to the United States, and even whether it is occurring. It is also key to note that individuals in these groups pay less attention to complicated fact-based arguments. Instead, narratives and visual imagery may be a more effective message for these groups. So why are people disengaged? How can people be disengaged on an issue as pressing as this one? In the past, our strategy has been science-focused, environment-focused, and negative. Has this been successful? Well, you will remember from earlier that 80% of those who are alarmed by climate change pay close attention to environmental news. It seems that environmental channels have brought a lot of people on board. This might be why we are all so inclined to think that convincing people on the facts will bring them on board, since this is the way a lot of us came to care about the issue. However, for much of the population, scientific information seems inaccessible and doom and gloom messaging doesn't make people turn out, it makes them tune out. For these people, a different approach is needed. Storytelling is one of our best tools as climate advocates. It is helpful with multiple groups in the 6 Americas, but for the low engagement groups, it can do 2 things. Number 1, bring climate impacts, which may seem far away or far in the future, closer to home. And number 2, convey social norms by telling what other people are doing to combat climate change. This second one is aided if we ourselves set a good example of the kinds of norms we want people to adopt, whether it is voting for the climate or calling members of Congress. Some people don't prioritize the environment. This is fine. Connect climate change with issues they do care about. For instance, impacts on the economy, impacts on human health, disproportionate harm to Black and Brown communities, and an increase in refugees displaced by climate disasters. especially in terms of the economy, apply what we learned for high involvement individuals and focus on benefits of switching to clean energy, including jobs and energy independence. Positive messaging can go a long way with all 6 groups. Those are just some ideas, though. The most important thing is that we listen to people to discern what they care about. Arthur lists 2 things he views as important, and we can tie climate change into both without confronting him on its importance as a standalone issue. So, for instance, number 1, he says the actual waste we are producing. You can tie this value that he states into climate change with something like the following. One type of waste I worry about is pesticide runoff. The warmer water is, the more likely pesticides are to cause algal blooms and eutrophication. Or for number 2, he says that he's worried about the impact we are having on the environment. So you can address that with something like climate change acts on top of the other harms we cause, making it even harder for nature to cope. For instance, bees that are dealing with pesticides and parasites will be far less likely to survive them if they also have to deal with heat waves and irregular flower availability.
So finally, we move on to the group of Americans that is highly involved with climate change and yet has a negative attitude toward climate change and climate change action. The actions that we recommend taking with this group are listening to values and, again, telling stories. So to start, we have one more of these videos. This time it is from a Republican senator in 2015. Take a listen to the video and decide how you would come up with a response to Senator Inhofe.
And climate has always changed, and it always will. There's archaeological evidence of that. There's biblical evidence of that. There's historic evidence of that. It will always change. The hoax is that there are some people who are so arrogant to think that they are so powerful they can change climate. Man can't change climate.
So once you come up with your response, let's delve into the groups that Senator Inhofe belongs to, the doubtful and dismissive groups. Both share some key traits in that both tend to be conservative and individualistic, and are actually highly certain of their climate change beliefs and tend to be more engaged on the issue than the low engagement groups that Eva talked about. The key thing that defines the doubtful and dismissive groups is that they strongly hold the belief that either climate change is not human-caused or that it's not happening at all. So how do we deal with this? I would guess that everyone listening to this call is in the alarmed group about climate change, meaning I can guess that we are most likely highly egalitarian and probably liberal. In other words, we come to climate change because of its disproportionate impacts or some sense of injustice, and we want to see a heavy-handed government approach that corrects these flaws. We can understand a lot of resistance to the science of climate change as resistance to the perceived conflict with people's values that it poses. And so instead of trying to directly persuade people that are conservative, individualistic, and in the doubtful and dismissive groups, it might be more fruitful to try to appeal to their values. So this is a pretty dense slide of all the values-based appeals that you can take with people that are conservative. Just to briefly go through them, tribalism is really the argument that without conservative engagement on the issue, Democrats are going to have full control over the solution. Ideology, you can appeal to personal responsibility, that if you pollute, you should have to pay for that, and bring up that there are actually pro-market climate solutions out there, including a carbon price. Trusted messengers can be an effective tool to bring someone around in climate change. And finally, making the business argument for climate change action, including one of the things that has made our businesses successful is being able to rely on a stable economy, first of all, but also a stable climate. So these are all appeals that you can take, but the most important thing is really to listen to people that come from different backgrounds and different belief systems than you, and find ways to connect the issue of climate change to those beliefs. If appeals to values don't work, the one thing someone can't deny is a personal story. One of my classmates and I met with our conservative climate denier representative in high school. What really got him to shift on the issue and actually join the House Climate Solutions Caucus was hearing our stories about the ways that climate change had impacted us and our community. If you feel like you don't have a personal story to tell, keeping things local maybe about impacts to farmers and outdoorsmen if you're in a rural area, are especially effective stories to tell, since these are groups that conservatives tend to have a lot of respect for. So finally, in summary, we've gone over the fact that there are 6 different Americas on climate change and some of the key characteristics that define these groups, as well as key strategies to appeal to those groups, including looking for unexpected allies, keeping messaging positive, telling stories, expanding the climate change impacts that we talk about beyond the environment, and listening to values. And so we broke these approaches down by different groupings within the 6 Americas, but really they can be useful for any of the groups. And even outside of the world of climate change, these approaches can be strong tools to build consensus with someone that comes from a different perspective than you. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope that the tools we shared prove to be helpful in your own life and your own climate advocacy. Thank you again.